On behalf of the county, Canaan Associates, and DPZ Co-Design, welcome to the third meeting of Series 2 of 3. My name is Marina Corey. I'm with DPZ, and I'm joined by Matt Lambert and Mike Wyke. From Canaan, we have Eliza Giuliano with us, as well as many more from the county, including Alberto, Olin, and Marcos. And all these folks will be helping answer questions during the 2 Q&A pauses we're going to have today. As a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan goals and the particularities of each of the 6 market areas. It provided detailed references about each area of the county to assist us all in better celebrating the general character and individuality of each area. It also touched on strategies for growth based on what areas in the market areas will generally be maintained, what areas will evolve, what areas can transform, and what areas will grow. As a follow-up, this series is an introduction to sectors and place types, 2 technical terms you will learn about today that are intended to help further guide growth in a more predictable manner and in a way that supports the mayor's initiatives and what we're also hearing many county residents want and support. The rest of the Series 2 meetings will take place next week. Series 3 in late spring will be about the zoning code, and which are the zoning regulations intended to support the policies that will help further guide growth, development, and conservation. So we look forward to your active participation, collaboration, and engagement with this team as we collectively map and describe the ways in which the county should grow over the next few decades and what it can actually look like. A few housekeeping rules before we begin the presentation. This meeting is being recorded, and as you can see, it'll be available for viewing on the Vision 2050 website. It's also being live streamed on Orange County social media. Attendees may ask questions through Zoom using the Q&A button and through Orange County Facebook within the live stream comments. And we're going to do our best to gather them all and answer these questions as best as we can in the time frame that we have. This meeting focuses on 2 topics, as I mentioned, the sectors and the place types. The additional information, we ask that you also stay on this after we finish our presentation and answer the questions so that you can participate in a survey that will help us further tailor subsequent presentations accordingly. So a reminder to please stay involved, and the website again. And I'm now going to turn it over to Alberto Vergas, the planning director for Orange County.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Marina. I appreciate everybody's presence tonight. I'm excited to be here with you. I hope you are as excited as we are to continue to engage the residents of Orange County to help us better plan the next 30-year growth horizon as Orange County continues to grow. And we want to be able to better understand the overall approach of this alternative way of planning has to do with raising to the very top the priority of the county's diversity. Understand how the county's different scenarios in every aspect, from lifestyles to topography, as well as development trends, have to really do with the sensitivity of some of those established areas in the county and how to interact with those established areas, and begin to focus a little bit more in targeted areas where it really makes sense. We are beginning to identify better tools for defining those areas that should be targeted for growth in a very sustainable manner. We have started this conversation back in December of last year with the first series of the town hall meetings, where we introduced in a very detailed manner the market areas. Those market areas are really planning geographical areas in the county that, and we talked a little bit about the socioeconomic conditions as well as the historic conditions that got those areas to be what they are today. Statistical analysis was also shared in detail. And what the market areas help us do is really help us understand the general organization of this comprehensive plan. It helps us engage you as the residents. You're here in the core from the core market area today to talk about the specific conditions. And we will continue next week with the East Market area on Monday, the Rural East Market area on Wednesday, and the Southwest Market area on Thursday of next week. And you can see those general delineations as shown on the screen right now. The topic, as Marina introduced them, have to do with sectors and place types. And if there is a leave behind or a leave behind for us and a takeaway for you about the topic tonight, is really that the sectors themselves are really begin to be directly tied to the vision. They are the vision map. They will begin to really delineate the areas of the county that set certain level of policy for those areas, and provide guidance as to how they will develop, redevelop, or stay pretty much the same. And the place types is a new nomenclature or new definition, if you would, of the future land uses. And they would describe the intended character of those places, the mix of uses, and the levels of densities and intensities that each one of those places would have. As you know, and we have discussed this, there's about 21 existing future land uses in our current comprehensive plan from 2010 to 2030. This vision expands from that and begins to better associate the type of environment with the uses and the mix of those uses in order to better assert the conditions of the county and celebrate the diversity that I explained. So before I turn it over to Matt Lambert with DPC, I'm going to ask the district commissioners that are present tonight. First, let me welcome you and thank you for your time tonight. We're looking forward to having you as part of this journey, of course, and give you an opportunity as well to give any welcoming remarks. So with that, I'll start with District 5 Commissioner Emily Bonilla. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
All right, great. So I just wanted to say that this is something I've been looking forward to for a very long time. I know this was first started back in 2017 after all the controversial issues we were having with land use development. So this is an innovative way to move forward and try to see what the people really want their communities to look like. So it's something I am excited about and want to continue hearing what the people have to say. So thank you for being here and participating.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm going to follow with District 6 Commissioner Victoria Ziplin. Welcome, Commissioner.
Well, thank you, Alberto, and thank you to staff, and thank you to the consultants that have poured so much of their time into this presentation. And I also want to give a special thank you to the residents who have joined us tonight and with the previous meetings that we've had. It's important for our residents as we plan for the future as their government leaders. It's important that we hear their input and we understand how they would like to see their county grow and their individual communities. So with that being said, thank you again. And I look forward to hearing, some input from the residents.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt to continue with the program tonight. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Alberto. Well, in the last town hall series, as we mentioned a bit, all these very complex topics were addressed to frame the importance of what a comprehensive plan is. Much of the public in general may not know what a comprehensive plan is. They don't interact with it on a regular basis. Many topics that were covered in the last series, included how much will the county most likely grow? What are the dynamics of generations, growth, and aging? What are the formats that growth may take in the future? What is it that really affects housing affordability and whether people have options for different modes of transportation? What are some places that are more or less connected to regional transportation? What are new mobility technologies and the current state of planning? and how zoning works with the comprehensive plan, and so on. There's quite a lot that goes into comprehensive plans, and a lot to be considered when developing a vision that looks forward for 30 years. Now, 30 years, of course, is a long time. Sometimes we forget, but if we jump back 6 of those, we're in 1840, sewing machines were the new thing. And the last 30 years took us from these early personal computers that were in some people's homes, those that could afford them, to having advanced computers in our pockets, on our wrists, in our cars, and managing rovers on Mars. So where we go in the next 30 years, a lot could happen. And comprehensive plans are designed to take a look forward to that distant future, to determine our desires and to align all the policies and activities of the county towards a shared future vision. Of course, Orange County is a hotbed of innovation and home to a diverse and growing population. And as we look at growth management, we have to consider how to grow while protecting sensitive natural lands and to preserve the county's rural heritage, to grow in ways that increase equity and affordability, mobility options, and access to jobs, and places for friends, family, and of course, fun. So as a reminder, the current comprehensive plan was adopted in 2009. There's quite a lot of stuff in there, and Vision 2050 will also have quite a lot of stuff, but we really hope to make it more friendly to the public in general, to assure that we set clear expectations, to assure that you can understand where the county intends to go as you residents are helping to shape that. So today we're going to focus on growth and development policies in general, and the ways that Vision 2050 leads the county towards a future vision. A major component of that growth is the population projection. The county has been growing pretty steadily, as you can see in this chart. The line is almost linear. But just like the cone of uncertainty that you have with hurricanes, the exact future is uncertain. But we have a good idea of the general path, which leads towards significant growth in the next 30 years. These projections, the average, project about 690,000 people. That's quite a lot, quite a lot of new neighbors in the county. Now, for comparison, the city of Orlando has a population of 280,000 people. So the growth in the county over 30 years is projected at 2.5 times the population of the city of Orlando. Now, to think that growth would occur evenly across the whole county, that's just bad planning. And to allow growth to happen in this form would be bad policy. That would result in degraded quality of life by increasing driving, increasing the cost of infrastructure and the tax burden associated with it, and reducing rural and natural lands. So I think we can agree that these are not desirable outcomes. Now, we plan in order to direct growth to specific places, not everywhere. And one of the 2 components of growth management in Vision 2050 is sectors. Sectors direct growth to where it's encouraged. We also plan in order to direct the character of new development in those places where growth is desirable. When we consider the county as a whole, it is quite diverse, and it should continue to offer people a diversity of options for where to live, diverse job opportunities and educational choices, and a diversity of ways to get around. In Vision 2050, place types direct the character of future growth through form, intensity, block structure, civic spaces, and the mix of uses and mobility. So sectors are large and place types fall within them. Together, these direct growth towards a future vision. Where growth occurs and the character it takes is a key component of Vision 2050, and these live in the future land use component of the comprehensive plan. Sectors determine where growth should occur, and place types determine the form that growth will take. Now, while most residents don't directly interact with the comprehensive plan and future land use, we hope that the Vision 2050 document is one that everyone can understand, contribute to the vision, and build expectations from for how the future will shape. So in the larger overall picture that sectors and place types fit in, there's other elements to discuss. Some are policy and some are not. This is just to help understand what different structures and terminology is used. At the top here, there are incorporated municipalities. These are cities like Orlando who determine their own growth policies and their own goals. Next are the market areas. Alberto spoke about this, and they were discussed in the prior meeting. These are really a tool that allows us to zoom into parts of the county that have different characteristics, to analyze those places, engage with people who live and work there, and to consider how policies should react to different contexts. Next down in this list anyhow is the urban service area. It doesn't really fit exactly, nestle in. It sort of overlaps a few things. But just to know anyways, it's a policy boundary that determines where utility services will be offered. It's an indirect growth policy in that it limits where growth can occur from an urban versus rural standpoint. And then the following three elements on this list are the subject of this and the following set of town hall meetings. They work together to control the intensity and form that growth takes. So today, as you've probably heard too much already, we're going to look at sectors and place types. And the next series, we'll look at Orange Code. That's closely tied to place types. So first, we'll jump into sectors. Now remember, sectors determine where growth can occur. They also determine the amount of growth in each area through place types that are allowed in the sectors. Technically, they're limiting the different place types, which are the new future land use categories. We'll look at these after the sectors. To understand the sectors, though, it's best to think about them determining where growth is directed. Here are the 6 sectors in Vision 2050 on the left. And as a little reminder on the right, the incorporated areas like Orlando and Apopka, which are not included in sectors, are those because those municipalities manage their own growth. So they're outside of the sectors. At the top left on this list is the targeted sector. This includes the growth priority areas. Next is the intended sector, where existing area-wide plans have been developed and where existing plan developments have been approved and entitled. These 2 sectors are where nearly all future growth is directed. Following are the established and rural sectors retaining their current character. These areas may see a small amount of growth, but in general, growth is discouraged. And the preservation sector is for large and contiguous preserved natural areas. And then at the bottom is the special sector. This is for more complicated land uses like power plants, water treatment, airports, and universities, which have non-typical characteristics and require special consideration. So here's how they break down in land area. The vast majority of the county is within the preserved, rural, and established sectors, where significant growth is discouraged. Instead, growth is directed to the targeted and intended sectors, roughly 12% of the county. Here in chart form, we've specified roads here, you might notice, because the road rights of way, when you look over the entire county, they cover a lot of ground when you add them up. So we've lumped them in with the incorporated areas since we're talking about land use. Anyhow, incorporated areas and road rights of way occupy quite a large amount of the county, but not as much as the preserved and rural sectors. Areas that are prioritized for development in the targeted and intended sectors, these remain a small percentage. We'll take a closer look at each sector. First, though, in the areas where significant growth is discouraged, and then to the areas where growth is encouraged. Here's a map of the county overall. We'll see how sectors are mapped out at a county-wide level, and then we'll zoom into the core market area for a closer look. Incorporated areas cover about 24% of the county overall. We've only labeled a few of them here, really for orientation and for legibility. If we marked them all, you couldn't read them. These areas, as I mentioned before, manage their own growth policies, and the sectors apply to unincorporated areas only. The preserved sector is simplest of all. These are lands currently in preservation or with policies directing for future preservation. The sector includes only large and contiguous areas that are in preservation, while many developments may have additional smaller conservation easements within them. A lot of those are in the established sector. This is the preserved sector map. It's about 21% of the county overall. The rural sector includes lands in agricultural use, rural settlements, large undeveloped lands where growth is discouraged, and natural areas that are not yet in preservation. This is the rural sector map. Like the preserved sector, the rural sector covers about 21% of the county, oddly enough. Then the established sector. This includes most of the county's residential areas with a goal to maintain the current character. This is the established sector map, which are residential areas principally surrounding and in between incorporated areas. The established sector, this includes about 13% of the county overall. If you add these three together, you can clearly see the areas where growth is discouraged, comprising 55% of the county. Of course, we're excluding the incorporated areas in that number because they set their own rules. And if you have kids like I do, or you spend a lot of time around them, you may be familiar with the healthy eating strategy being used today called Go Slow and Woe, encouraging kids to eat lots of healthy foods, the Go, not eat too many processed foods, the Slow, and very rarely eat sweets and treats, the Woe. We can look at the sector map in the same light, with the Woe areas where we want to discourage growth, like the preserved and rural sectors, the slow areas like the established sector, and then next we'll look at the areas that fall into this sort of Go area where we encourage growth. So the intended sector is a Go area. This includes places that have already, and already means before Vision 2050, that have already been planned for new growth, including entitled planned developments and area-wide plans. This sector represents about 5.5% of the county and includes places like Horizon West, Innovation Way, and Lake Pickett. And lastly, the targeted sector. This is where most new growth will be directed and encouraged. This sector generally includes existing commercial, industrial, and higher density residential land located along the county's major roadway networks and areas along its future planned transit routes. Here's the targeted sector map. It represents about 6% of the county. The targeted sector is heavily concentrated in the I-4 corridor and the South Industrial area, as well as major roadways leading to incorporated areas. Mapped along the major roads, the targeted sector is closely tied to future transportation planning, coordinating land use and transportation. This land use and transportation planning ideal is fully embedded in Vision 2050 and also in Orange Code. Both of those are exactly the type of planning documents that the new Florida DOT context standards are written to support. Together, the intended and targeted sectors are where growth is encouraged, about 11.5% of the county. To fill the gap is the special sector, a small amount of the county overall, including places like UCF, the power plant, the golf center, and other special places that are not what we call normative development. These places need special consideration and special rules. So altogether, we have a full sector map of the county. The map directs where growth should occur and how much should occur in any area. At this scale, it's hard to determine individual details of this, so we'll look at the core market area specifically. But first, just to remind on this Go Slow Woe way of looking at things, sectors are pretty clear from this perspective, directing where and to what extent growth should occur. So let's zoom into the core market area now and see how sectors are mapped here. Now, most of the core market area falls within incorporated municipalities, the city of Orlando. The incorporated area covers 59% in total. And remember, again, I'll say it so many times, that cities manage their own growth policies and they're not managed by the county. So most of the core market area is outside of the purview of the comprehensive plan. Here are those preserved areas comprising less than 1% of the market area, and they may even be small enough to handle at the place type level. As these maps are in progress, the sector map and the place type map, this type of discussion is ongoing. Preserved areas are intended to cover very large and contiguous natural areas, and these ones are a little bit smaller. So we'll discuss that later in the place types. For rural areas, well, there are none in the core market area. But it's the established sector really that covers most of the core market area outside of incorporated areas. While the established sector covers just 24% of the overall market area, it really covers nearly all of the unincorporated county land within the core market area. There's little preserved and no rural sectors in the core market area, and that preserved may be established sector as well. But in any case, a quarter of the market area, or most of it when you take away the incorporated areas, falls within this no and low growth set of sectors. So now for growth. Concerning the intended sector, where new growth is in process or has already been approved, there isn't any in the core market area. Really, this market area has been pretty fully developed to date. The only path forward with growth is infill, but being around the city of Orlando, infill along major roadways is a huge opportunity. That infill is prioritized to the targeted sector, 9% of the market area. Here, the sector's intent is pretty legible: to cover commercial corridors along major roads and large commercial developments at the intersection of multiple major roadways. This strategy itself is heavily transit-oriented, aiming growth to places where it can support transit and support surrounding neighborhoods, but not to encroach into them. We'll touch more on this in the place types discussion later. From a go slow whoa standpoint, here's how the sector map breaks down in the core market area. Note that the missing numbers are the special sector and road rights of way, but in all, this shows that most of the area is incorporated, quite a lot is in the established or slow sector, and a little less than 10% is targeted for growth in the go category. Again, from a sector standpoint, this is the composite sector map. So I hope this provides a strong understanding of the sectors portion of this. Next, we'll get into place types and sectors influence place types, and we'll clarify this later. But before we move on, we want to see if there are any questions from attendees or viewers or items that the county or consultant team would like to add concerning the sectors. Marina?
Thank you, Matt. There's a couple of questions, specific questions, but I also want to ask you some questions that we asked yesterday because I think it's pertinent to the discussion. So the first one is, since sectors aren't regulatory, why are they necessary? Why can't you just put down a FLU or future land use on each parcel?
Yeah, well, luckily I've changed some of the text later on, so we'll touch on that a little bit more in place types. But in general, it's that if you have no guidelines or guidance for how future land use should be applied, then it's really hard to determine when you're deciding on future land use changes if they should be allowed in one area or another. If it's parcel by parcel, like most future land use is considered, there's nothing that tells you that one particular property should be residential or industrial or commercial necessarily. So sectors and place types, they kind of zoom out from the individual parcel level and begin looking at larger areas. Place types, a slightly larger area, and sectors, a much larger area. And in those, we can direct which types of places and growth and uses should be encouraged. So the sectors take a broad look across the county and say, well, we want to encourage infill growth of high intensity in these areas principally, and not these areas. And here are the areas that we'd like to generally preserve the character of. And here are the areas that are rural. And those layer on top of the place types. And it's like a decision tree in terms of what is the appropriate future land use for that area. Because you don't want to willy-nilly just change the future land uses. That creates unpredictable growth and a lot of the land use problems that were referenced earlier.
Thank you.
And Marina, before we go to the next question, I was just sent a note that District 2 Commissioner Christine Moore joined us at the beginning of the program, and for some reason she was not elevated to the panelist, but I see her now. So Commissioner, welcome, good evening, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity as well to provide any welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Alberto. This is a wonderful conversation, and I'm trusting that we have a lot of folks from District 2 participating, and it's very important to understand the terminology and the planning enough so that we can contribute and add ideas, and now is the time. So I just really thank everyone for participating, and thank you for making it so we could all understand it and participate.
Thank you. It's encouraging to see commissioners participate actively in these sessions. So Matt, it was interesting to see the allocation, and I think this map is actually very revealing of where the targeted sectors are and where the established sectors are. But you spoke about targeted sectors encouraging infill, but we also know that the existing will encourage infill of a different kind. Maybe you can describe I know you'll get into it a little bit with the place types, but generally speak about the infill opportunities that exist in the existing sectors and the infill opportunities that would exist in the targeted sectors.
Sure. Yeah, and the reason that we called the established slow growth is because there are still large parcels that are undeveloped around or may have entitlements that are able to develop more more housing on them. But what the goals of the established sector is for any growth that occurs there to be reflective of the character of the area that's already established. So to not significantly change the character of the area. So that growth would be like what is already in place, and because it's not at a higher intensity, it's at the same intensity. That's a much slower growth. So we describe it as slow, versus the targeted areas, which tend to, there are some undeveloped parcels in the targeted areas, but they tend to be more shopping centers that may have aged and have the ability to redevelop. You know, there's a 20-30 year time frame that they typically would redevelop in, and when those shopping centers and other uses along these major roadways, when there's pressure to redevelop, the targeted sector encourages them to redevelop with a mix of uses and in a form that supports transportation. So those are the higher intensity areas for infill growth. So it's into the targeted sector and not in the established sector. Both areas have land that could still be subdivided, some places that have never been developed, but it's really the attention to the character of the existing place and the intensity of that development that differs between the sectors.
That's good. So the next question I'm going to direct to Alberto, because it's actually a good one. With the incorporated areas taking so much of the developable area, as Matt showed, it occupies 59% of this area. How can a plan be made without cooperating with those incorporated areas? It seems pretty piecemeal and not comprehensive. So, and I know you'll address that, Alberto, but maybe we can also speak about where there is cooperation, such as things like transit lines and all of that, but where there is, but they both operate on different systems, as Matt indicated before. So maybe you can elaborate on where there is alignment and where there isn't. But it doesn't mean that these areas, which are still significant, don't get to be thought of rationally and us considering how it should be growing over time.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. Please keep sending all the good questions my way, please. Thank you for the question. I'm just going to say Orange County Planning Division and other divisions as well continue to engage the adjacent municipalities in quarterly meetings and impromptu meetings that happen throughout the course of the year for different specific topics. Whenever we have planning strategies that we understand may be adjacent to other municipalities that are drastic in terms of perhaps changing the approach towards growth, like in the case of the targeted sector, where we have common lines of transportation, a corridor that is perhaps in the transit place type category, where we're thinking of alternative modes in different ways when we speak about complete streets, and when we think about that outdoor room environment and how that's going to be designed. We don't want it to be piecemealed, which was part of the question, and I like that because clarification is needed where we understand that a corridor needs to have a level of transition. It may be, even though it may be a continuous element of transportation, there could be a slower transition where different densities and intensities could happen in an intense manner in certain areas that may be incorporated or unincorporated, and the coordination between Orange County and those municipalities needs to continue to be fluid. So we hope that as we plan for the next 30 years here, with all of your comments and help, we do our job. You can hold us accountable, planning staff and others from Orange County, that will continue to do our best level of coordination with the adjacent municipalities to have the best scenario in the built environment.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to look at the map that's up on Matt's screen. You see the major thoroughfares, especially on the northwest corner. You see how their growth is envisioned along to be targeted sectors. And in the southeast corner, where the street network is maybe not as important, it's more of an established character. But you do notice that a lot of the targeted areas are abutting right up against the unincorporated areas, or the incorporated areas, I should say. So there's a couple of questions that people are asking, which I'm going to hold on to because they'll be more appropriate to be answered at the level of the after the place types, but we will speak to them. But I wanted to touch on one other topic and open it up for both Matt and Alberto to speak to, because I'm seeing two sides of a coin here, which is often the case. So someone said, what is the plan to offer affordable housing? Rents are over the roof, and buying a home, well, that is something that people don't even think about because wages aren't high enough. So we know that there's some serious movement on the level of affordable housing. On the other hand, there's another question that says, has there been discussion about where development should decrease to zero lot line development? More people on less acreage does not help. So there's a contradiction in those two questions. So I'd like you both to maybe, from a policy standpoint, but also from a planning standpoint, address these questions.
Well, I can get started with the affordable housing side of the question. Mm-hmm. The Board of County Commissioners has accepted a 10-year action plan, and it's called Housing for All. Within that action plan is basically specific recommendations and strategies that address the next 10 years in a way that it directly points to our land development code, identify the barriers that exist today for the development of affordable housing solutions, and begin to eliminate, it addresses ideas and opportunities to begin to relax and eliminate some of those barriers for the incorporation of affordable housing and attainable housing, those much needed product types, if you would, that are needed for the workforce, and the incorporation of those product types in adjacent to established neighborhoods is a very well-known strategy that is implemented or addressed not only countywide but at the state level as well as the nation, and it's called Missing Middle. There are opportunities where strategic product types are nestled into neighborhoods that introduce the element of compatibility. It's really hard to tell if an affordable housing, an attainable housing solution is nestled into established neighborhood or adjacent to it as a transition, in order to create much more opportunities for a much more vibrant community in that regards, and desirable in many different ways. What we try to get away from is what used to be the only solution many decades ago, where you had only a standalone product for an affordable housing solution, which used to be the projects in other states. But we want to move away from those one-way solutions and begin to look at all of the diverse opportunities here. 86,000 units is projected to be part of our environment in the next 10 years. And 35% of those 86,000 units is intended to go towards housing affordable solutions. And the task and the challenge is that this 10-year action plan brings not only those regulatory incentives in which it engages the development community to address some of these solutions, but it also addresses financial incentives. With a housing trust fund, unprecedented in Orange County, has already been adopted by the Board of County Commissioners to help incentivize the development of affordable housing and integrate those in ways that we haven't done in previous years. So it's very robust and very focused in the targeted sectors and in areas of transition as well.
Thank you.
So I actually do have a couple of things to add, if you can believe it. One is about some of the aspects of the cost of development, and we'll be getting into this when we look at Orange Code, but a big piece there has been to try to streamline the development process by making clear the expectations of the outcome of development from a zoning standpoint, and to make the process of getting to approvals, especially for smaller projects, much simpler, which then saves money on the back end and contributes less to the overall cost of development. And we work a lot with people who do development at the large scale and at the small scale, and we're constantly talking to them about the barriers that are in place all over the country that contribute to the cost of housing. Of course, land is one piece of that, and that's where the sort of two sides of a coin piece in terms of number of people per land area comes up. And I'll say for that, there's not one solution that everyone likes. We won't all agree. I like something that's different from what Marina likes. It's different from anybody probably here on the call. And the county provides a lot of different environments for that. Some are higher density, higher intensity, and many are lower density and lower intensity. So for some people, they want low intensity, and some people want high intensity. Now, high intensity does help to contribute overall over a very large number of units more towards some natural affordable housing. Now that is a lot for rental when you get into the very high densities, but even for the missing middle types that Alberto was talking about, which fit more naturally into neighborhoods, those are higher intensity than, say, much of the sort of 6 units an acre type of development that's out there. And hopefully we can clarify some of the density things before the next series of meetings. But to the corridors and these infill areas, the goal of intensification is tied with transportation, and you can't have viable transportation systems if you don't have nodes of intensity along them. Those are really what make the transit stops work, and so that strategy is a very clear and strong one in the targeted sector. But again, the established sector isn't targeted at absorbing so much of that new housing growth, but there does need to be some diversification to have naturally occurring affordable housing in addition to subsidized and other methods for.
Thank you, Matt. And in fact, I think the series 3 will really get into talking about predictability of form and helping people understand the variety, as Alberto spoke about, the missing middle housing that can easily integrate into single-family neighborhoods in a way that is in keeping with the character of the houses that are around it, independent to the more dense types that go into the corridors. But the affordability can also be addressed through these the smaller homes, such as cottage courts and all of that are very much in keeping with, we tend to think about affordable housing in one or two building types, and this housing for all, which is really expanding our understanding of the typologies and the zoning code and the place types, as you're going to see Matt explain, encouraging or indicating where they are appropriate and where they're not appropriate is part of painting this larger picture. Matt, I'm going to ask you one more question, because you spoke about the cost of development hindering affordability. One of the first questions talks about, has there been a discussion about increasing impact fees for development instead of raising taxes for those who are already here? A question we also hear a lot of.
Well, I don't know what discussions there have been, but what happens when you raise impact fees for new development is that you make it immediately unaffordable. If you go to I was just thinking of some of the places that we've tried to develop projects in California, and they have impact fees for a single family home of upwards of $40,000 to $60,000, and that immediately makes it unaffordable. I live in Oregon now. We have high impact fees that makes affordability very difficult. So impact fees really are about paying for county services and infrastructure. The way we tend to look at it is to use the infrastructure that exists in a more efficient manner so that the cost of maintaining that infrastructure is shared over more households. And that's what infilling in the targeted sector is all about. By infilling along these major roadways, we provide more people in the area to contribute towards the money necessary to maintain that infrastructure, to fund transportation options, and to run the county overall.
So thank you. I want to throw one more question to you, and then one last one to Alberto before, and then the other questions I'm going to keep for when we talk about the place types. But this is another very good one, which is for established areas, are there plans to improve walkability, transportation, and/or recreation? And who wants to take that one? I mean,
I don't know if there's, yeah. So far, there aren't specific plans, but the place types. One of the goals of the place types in the established sector is to associate policies with the type of development that is in place, that is existing. So, for example, if and we'll talk about the place type of suburban neighborhood fabric or traditional neighborhood fabric. And one example, suburban neighborhood fabric may need improvements in terms of walkability and bikeability, but those are different types of improvements than would be needed in the infill targeted sector and those place types. So it's really about aligning the type of change that is needed for all those areas. So yes, the established sector needs has needs, and there are plans related to that, but the sectors and place types are really about associating solutions and policies that match what's on the ground rather than being broad across the entire county.
Yeah, and I would say that, improving walkability is a goal of the for everywhere. And the zoning code that's being written, Orange Code, is very much about helping to improve walkability by addressing the way in which buildings will meet the street in a more pedestrian-friendly manner, which is one, the garages will take, or the garages and parking are relegated either to the back, or their visual impact is diminished on the front. Because those are things we know will discourage people from walking. New communities will have to put sidewalks in on both sides. I mean, all this kind of stuff the whole code is intended to encourage walkability. And in terms
I see that Commissioner Moore has a question as well.
No, I just wanted to address that question because that's really where the commissioners come in. And the county has a $2 million budget, and we've been working extensively in District 2 on neighborhoods who haven't had sidewalks whatsoever. And then through our R&R fund, Public Works does a fantastic job of maintaining the roadways, coming back out to deal with sidewalks that maybe have been raised and you need to be shaved down. And so if they ever have a problem, they can call one of the commissioner's office or use 311. But I find the county does an excellent job in some of these established areas. Thank
you, Commissioner Moore. There's Alberto. I'm going to direct the last question to you before we move on to the description of the place types. But I would like to preface it by saying we have some questions about what type of growth is anticipated in the GO areas or the targeted areas, and what type of mix of uses can be developed in those areas. And for those who ask those questions, Matt's going to address that quite specifically in his description of the place types. So please bear with us on that. For the one person who also asked if we'll be able to, if there'll be maps in which people can zoom in to these areas, yes, there will be. Once we've made sort of final, our internal, final is by no means final, sort of refinements, these maps will be posted on the website for people to really dig deep, because we want to hear feedback. We need you all to help shape where these, especially where these place type boundaries are located. And you'll see examples of that Matt's going to show you. But Alberto, the last question is directed to you because it's at the scale of the market areas. And it's someone's asking if Stanley Road is in the core of or in the northwest. So could you comment on whether the market area boundaries are advisory, they're certainly not regulatory, and if those can or will change or not?
So the market areas are not regulatory. They will not be necessarily an element in the comprehensive plan that would be identifiable other than a map that makes reference to them. They would provide order in the comprehensive plan in the way that the policies are organized in the comprehensive plan, how the comprehensive plan overall format is structured. So it will help us orient each one of the policies for growth, for the different conditions of scales in the county, and better understand the context of the county in that manner. So it is an organizational factor, if you would, that plays a very important role in this process. We're engaging everybody today in a very context-sensitive manner. All of those residents that are within the core market area are invited to participate, and we're doing the same thing throughout the county. They will continue to be strategic in the way that we communicate and in a way that we organize the comp plan, but they are not regulatory lines and delineations that are shown today are an element of that are very blurred in the map. If you want to see exactly where you live and how you relate to the particular delineation, if you would, that today identifies each one of these market areas, go to the website and hit the link that leads you to a PDF, a very high detailed PDF that you're able to see general references as to what these market areas are really all about.
Thank you, Alberto. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you, back to you now. We'll keep the rest of the questions for the place type descriptions because a lot of them relate to, can you help further understand, how the targeted areas grow, how the established areas grow? So it's a perfect introduction to the place types.
Yeah, sounds good. We've found that the sector brings up questions for the place types, right? So let's look at place types. We covered sectors first because sectors help determine which place types should be allowed in any given area. Some place types are of a greater intensity and density, and others of a lesser intensity and density. The targeted sector, for instance, encourages place types of a higher intensity than the established sector, which aims to maintain character and permitting place types of a lower density. But place types aren't just about density and intensity. They also determine how growth can occur through physical characteristics like height, block structure, civic spaces, the mix of uses, along with the density and intensity that are common in future land use. Many place type details are regulated in the zoning code update, Orange Code, and we'll discuss that in the next series again. In the comprehensive plan, place types are the new future land use categories, which regulate density and mix of uses, the allowable mix of zones, and describe the intended character of new development and of existing places. Place types are organized into 4 categories. The urban place types, which are applicable within the urban service area, the rural place types, which are applicable outside of the urban service area, open space place types, which cover natural areas and the county's larger parks, those are kind of everywhere, and special place types that are similar to the special sector, areas that need special rules or considerations, like universities, industrial districts, theme parks, airports, and utility areas. So like the other, we're going to go through the simple stuff and then get to the hard stuff. So first, the open space types, they're really the simplest. There are 2 types here, parks and recreation and natural areas. Both types can be located in any sector. Now on the right, you'll notice some dials. These are just to help compare one place type category from another in terms of relative access to transportation, relative density, and relative preservation of landscape. So you can look and see the dials, and the natural areas are all about the landscape preservation, but really not at all about density or access so much, but parks and recreation line up differently. When we get into the more urban types, then you'll see, density and access are higher and landscapes lower. They're really to compare one to the other. So again, parks and recreation, this covers the larger county parks and recreation facilities. They may be in any sector in the future, and many are there today. These enhance the surrounding area, and they tend to be near built-up places, most of the parks and recreation pieces. Now, the natural areas are places set aside for conservation. The preservation sector, preserved sector, is full of natural areas, but they're also found elsewhere in other sectors, typically within, say, a larger development plan. So those ones are simple, and we'll look at everything on a map shortly. Now we'll look at the rural place types. These also are relatively simple. Again, not in the core area, but we want you to understand the full menu of place types. The rural types are divided into 3 categories, and they're all located in the rural sector. These are all low density or very low density in character, with landscape and regional character preservation as a goal. Rural villages and hamlets are walkable places within the rural landscape, surrounded by land in rural use or natural areas. These places are rare, but they provide necessary services and some increased transportation access in the rural landscape. The rural villages and hamlets offer a degree of walkability by clustering development while preserving rural lands around them. Rural settlements should be well known. These are the very city developed areas within the rural landscape that exist today. In general, these are intended to be preserved in their current character. And these are the areas that we think of when we think of the rural environment. They have little to no development, and they're primarily in agricultural or pastoral use. So those ones are pretty easy. This one is too. The last easy one is a special place type. And just like the special sector, these types don't fit into the urban or rural categories, but they're key components of Orange County. These places require special rules and consideration. Here's 3 examples: industrial, institutional, and entertainment place types. But there's a few others like airports and utility facilities. So we just kind of group them together. They're things that are necessary and integral parts of the county, but they're not really so much about development. And finally, the urban place types. These types are the more complex of the overall place types. And so we'll focus on these details to try to help you understand them better. The urban types are further divided into 3 categories. There's centers, there are corridors, and then neighborhood fabric. Each of those categories, and don't worry, we'll dive into them each of those categories has 3 types within them, totaling 9. While it seems like a lot, it's not that many in terms of future land use categories. The structure, we're keeping it as simple and organized as possible. And the goal is really to be able to communicate the vision and expectations to the public. Centers are the most intense of this type, as you can see in the density piece, but that also means they have the most opportunity for transportation access, for example. So they're the most intense, and centers also are fully mixed use and at the higher end of density relative to other place types. Corridors connect those centers together. They're also mixed use, but at a lower density. And neighborhood fabric surrounds centers and corridors, which is generally residential in use, along with some supportive services like schools. So this is a typical diagram to illustrate the ideal structure. Centers are typically located at the intersection of major roads. They're intended to be mixed use and vibrant in the future, places for higher density and the convergence of mobility options, as well as being places for jobs and entertainment. Today, these are mostly shopping centers along major roads, but they will be encouraged to infill with housing and additional non-residential uses, along with civic spaces like small parks and plazas, to become vibrant places in the future. The lowest intensity is the neighborhood center. These are small, today typically non-residential, but also mixed use areas that may span just a few blocks, or smaller mixed use areas where neighborhood compatibility is really an important thing to retain. Many neighborhood centers existing today are intended to be enhanced and encouraged. Single-use neighborhood centers may be supplemented with additional housing, but growth in neighborhood centers is not necessarily a significant intensification as opposed to the urban centers. The goal here is compatibility in scale and activity with the surrounding fabric. Now, urban and regional centers, these are the more intense place types that you may associate with mixed use and vibrant places. Urban centers, the lower intensity of the two, may have buildings around 4 or 5 stories on a connected street grid, mixing non-residential and residential uses. These are places for entertainment, services, job centers, and places that a good percentage of the population may like to live, but they don't currently exist in a high quantity today. Now, regional centers, we don't have a separate image, but regional centers are more intense, just akin to downtown. There's a regional center planned at present for iDrive to become a key destination for the region, but not really others. These centers concentrate density and intensity to build vibrancy, the activity on the street. They're also key nodes along a future transit network, the type of development that transit needs to be efficient. A lot of riders in a small area. They're also ideal environments for multiple mobility solutions, including micromobility. Now, the corridors connect centers. They're generally located along transportation routes, providing housing and businesses with access to transit. Corridors are mixed use, typically adding residential uses to already commercial areas, but their intensity and density is much lower than centers. Generally being adjacent to neighborhood fabric, corridors must transition in intensity towards the surrounding neighborhoods, and the zoning code plays a role in that as well. Main Street corridors are the lower intensity. These exist throughout the county. They're low in scale. They may be single use today, but perhaps transition to low intensity mixed use in the future. These corridors provide important services to nearby residents, and many could benefit from street trees, and obviously bike racks here are missing, along with a code that encourages them to flourish. Main Street corridors are areas where the treatment of the street itself even requires particular attention. In the comprehensive plan, this is a key component to indicate to the state DOT that the future land use is aimed at walkable and bikeable places. A key component of the DOT's context-sensitive approach is to tie in with comprehensive plans to determine these areas. This has also been built into Orange Code, and we'll discuss that later. The next corridor is the transit corridor. These are located along existing and future transit routes. Because these have greater transit access, they're intended to be higher density and intensity than the neighborhoods around them to connect people with higher quality transit. They're mixed use areas, but the extent of non-residential would certainly vary based on the market demand. It's not the center of activity. These are the pieces between. They may have a little bit of non-residential in them. But the primary goal of the transit corridor is to increase the population living along premium transit routes, to increase ridership, and to also reduce future traffic impacts associated with population growth. Centers, of course, play a role with this. And then finally, there are the suburban corridors. These are located along major arterials that will remain more car dependent. Suburban corridors may be intensified with some mixed uses and beautified, but their relationship with the major roadways requires special consideration with respect to zoning and land use. For instance, without on-street parking, it's not really reasonable to require these buildings to be located right up to the street, but something like this may be perfectly viable. The remaining urban place types are neighborhood fabric, which makes up nearly all of the established sector, but also much of the targeted sector. Neighborhood fabric is principally residential, along with a few supportive services. The lowest intensity is suburban neighborhood fabric. This is located in the established sector and covers nearly all of that sector. You should be familiar with the type, the goals of which are generally to retain the existing character. Suburban neighborhood fabric is entirely single-family residential plus schools, religious facilities, clubhouses, and other such uses that are common to this type of development. Next is the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. Also generally in the established sector, these are areas that single-family townhomes and some multifamily houses are mixed together today. Like the prior type, these are targeted for preservation of character, but when mapped in the targeted sector, this is intended to diversify the area with additional missing middle housing types, as was discussed earlier. Suburban mixed neighborhood fabric is found where these types mix in close proximity today, and in some areas as a buffer between the higher intensity centers and the suburban neighborhood fabric behind them. The last of these place types is traditional neighborhood fabric. This is the higher intensity of the neighborhood fabrics. It's still not nearly as intense as a corridor, maybe three stories. We're not talking tall. These areas mix many housing types together into a tapestry of walkable blocks and open spaces. This is really the core of missing middle housing opportunities for new development and infill. Traditional neighborhood fabric includes schools and similar uses, along with a very small component of corner stores and cafes, these very small non-residential components. The principal goal of traditional neighborhood fabric is to provide a wide range of housing options in a walkable structure of blocks that's located near centers and corridors, which have opportunities for jobs and access to transit. So here's how they all fit together into sectors. Natural areas and parks and recreation on the right, they can really happen anywhere. So we just kind of clumped them down there. They're definitely in the preserve sector, but they land kind of everywhere. But the other place types are generally limited according to the sector. This is the goal, controlling the intensity of development as well as the character. So the goal of the targeted sector is to intensify, which is almost entirely through redeveloping those commercial properties on major roads and retaining the existing character elsewhere. It doesn't mean no growth, but instead it's very limited growth at a low volume or slow pace. So you see here sectors, special sector has special types, though the special types may also exist elsewhere. We'll see that. The targeted sector is focused on centers, the transit and Main Street corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. The intended sector has existing area-wide plans and PDs. The established sector has the suburban corridor and the suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabrics, and the rural areas has the 3 rural types. So that demonstrates the intent. Now we're going to look at how they can be applied to real places through a few examples. One is outside of the market area, just because it's a really good translation of how we talked about the centers and corridors and fabric, and then 2 more that are in the core market area. So here's the first clear example, the one of the centers, corridors, and fabric. This is where East Cimarron connects with OBT. Some of the area is incorporated, but we're not going to look at that yet. There was a good question earlier, a good comment earlier about that. And you'll see in this one why there needs to be coordination between municipalities. But in this case, we looked at the land uses within the surrounding municipalities to determine the right place type structure, which if you didn't look at that, you wouldn't really be able to determine that. So again, this is that intersection between OBT and Cimarron. The area is pretty common. There's an automobile-oriented commercial developments. Those are along the larger roads, along with larger shopping centers at the major intersections. Beyond the commercial properties, there's a wide range of housing, some large and small lot single family, some townhouse, and some multifamily. So here's a sector map for the area. It looks fairly simple, I hope. Most of the properties here are in the established sector. That's the sort of tan color, with the targeted sector located along the major roadways, plus a small node of existing commercial that's on the north on Thompson. That's that little small 4 corners of targeted sector. So here's the aerial, and there's a black outline, which is the outline of the targeted sector, just to see what it looks like on the ground. The targeted sector follows mostly the commercial properties on those roadways, and then single family neighborhoods beyond are within the established sector. Here's a map of place types for that area. We'll look specifically at the different types in a moment, but right now we just want to look at these sector lines between established and targeted. Within the targeted sector are the higher growth types of centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. Again, we'll detail that. And in the established sector are the lower growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. These are the centers. 2 of these may be categorized as urban centers. These are areas of commercial and multifamily that are large enough to develop a structure of blocks and civic spaces and can accommodate both mixed use and higher intensity residential infill. These are in the targeted sector, of course. The neighborhood center up on North Thompson, on the other hand, is much smaller and located surrounded by established sector. So this can accommodate a small amount of mixed use infill, but it especially needs to remain compatible with the surrounding neighborhood fabric, thus the neighborhood center, where it's important to maintain that compatibility. These are the corridors. They're commercial and multifamily properties that are located along major roadways, but are not included within the centers. In this case, both SEMREN and OBT are planned for future transit improvements, so they're both considered transit corridors. In fact, we'll mostly see transit corridors since there's a lot of transit routes and planned transit improvements. The transit corridors encourage more residential and mixed use infill than the suburban and Main Street corridors, again, to have population near the routes of transit. The remaining area is all neighborhood fabric. The majority of those properties, neighborhood fabric's divided into suburban in the light yellow, suburban mixed in the light orange, and traditional in the dark orange. They're differentiated by density, where suburban neighborhood fabric is the lowest density and traditional fabric is the highest density. Also in terms of mix of unit types, where the suburban fabric has principally single family homes and the traditional fabric has that full range of missing middle types, and the suburban mix is in between. So all of these, of course, are lower density than the corridors and centers. So when we look back at the place type map, this area clearly demonstrates the centers and corridors framework that we discussed earlier. The framework is important as we look to encourage more efficient transit functionality and increase ridership. Transit functions best when there are nodes of mixed use activities, those are the centers, that are connected in lines, which also lend energy to ridership on the corridors. Now here's what it looks like when you take out the incorporated areas. It's much more difficult to discern the pattern if we had just shown it as the unincorporated county. So the sector and place type mapping has to be designed in consideration for the land and municipal incorporated areas. Then we're removing them from the map to create the county's sector and place type maps. These, of course, as we said, they'll be shared on the Vision 20 website in the coming months as the first draft is put together. And you'll see shortly that there are a number of options and pieces that will be receiving feedback from the team as internally as we work through these, and then release to the public for comment and recommendations. Our hope is that the place types can make it easier to think about what the future land use directs in terms of future vision, and helps you all in decision making in terms of determining what's appropriate. So here's a specific example in the core market area. And just a warning, this area is complicated. So the mapping is complicated. There's roads going every which way. The rail line snakes through. You know, this Lockhart area is really kind of strange. It's hard to figure out from a mapping standpoint, but hopefully this demonstrates how the place types can clarify the future goals. You know, there's an odd mix here of various housing intensities, industrial, commercial, and all sorts of things going on. But the sector map's not too difficult. This sector map gives an initial and more simplified view of the overall area, hopefully helping to clarify. The special sector is mapped to areas intended to remain industrial. And we'll note that some of this is within incorporated areas. We'll see that later. The targeted sector is mapped along major roadway corridors. In this case, both OBT and Edgewater are corridors, and the land in between the two is all map targeted as a result. The remaining areas are in the established sector, which are those places that are clearly and consistently residential. The black line here is the boundary of the targeted sector, mainly to illustrate the corridors along OBT and Edgewater. Whether the special sector in the bottom right should be in the targeted sector is certainly worth considering. You know, these mapping activities illuminate these sorts of questions. When you see something that may be a little bit inconsistent, then it's a good thing to take a look at and consider. So here's the map of place types for the area, pointing out again the targeted sector, which includes the higher intensity types, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. And we'll look at each place type category, noting some of the exceptions as we go through this. In the established sector, of course, are the low growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. These are the centers. Here they're all neighborhood centers because their size is not large enough to be an urban center. But should an urban center be desirable, and be it desirable to convert some of the industrial in the future, the lower right bottom area could expand to meet 441, to meet OBT and become an urban center. So that's the sort of decision making that we can have going through the place type mapping. The other centers, however, are limited in size or they're in a lower traffic location, and they really wouldn't support being an urban center. So they remain neighborhood centers. These are the corridors. Most of these are transit corridors due to future transit plans, again, along the transit routes or within the targeted sector that are not included in the centers or in industrial land. Now in Lockhart, we have an additional type with the Main Street corridor that's on the upper left. That's the extension of Edgewater past the rail line. By applying the Main Street corridor here, zoning and transportation can be aligned to result in the outcome of a Main Street, bringing buildings up to the street and aligning transportation standards like sidewalk width and travel speed to support a future pedestrian area. So the corridor here helps to align both that land use and the future transportation for that portion of Edgewater, which at present, if you look at the DOT context mapping and so forth, isn't pushing for that direction. So by mapping this in the comprehensive plan, that changes the future transportation policy to align with the desired Main Street outcomes. The special sector here shows three types: industrial, institutional, and education. Again, we're still determining some of these things. Should the education be its own place type or part of other place types, like schools, which are allowed anywhere. So you'll notice Lockhart Elementary isn't called out separately, but the middle school is. So we're debating whether that should be part of the neighborhood fabric or its own sector. And so these sorts of things are what we're working on the next couple months before we publish these for public review. So the remaining area is neighborhood fabric. I've made the targeted sector red, so it's more legible. It was kind of harder to read with all this stuff going on. The deeper orange is traditional neighborhood fabric, which is entirely within the targeted sector. Again, the place for the most missing middle housing. And this is how the sectors guide place types. The traditional neighborhood fabric, a higher intensity, is mapped on the non-single family areas in the targeted sector. One exception to the sectors, though, which is clear here, is the suburban neighborhood fabric place type that's located within the targeted sector that's right next to Edgewater. This area is mapped for preservation of the existing character. So while it's in the targeted sector, the sector is not regulatory, it's advisory. Outside of the targeted sector, however, you're just going to see suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric that reflects the existing character of these areas. But as an advisory piece, we look here and we say, well, that seems like it's out of place, that suburban fabric. Let's double check. Should it be like that? And here's a single family detached neighborhood that may want to be preserved as such, and that's what this map shows. So here's the composite map, and we take out the incorporated areas, which there's not a lot of them. The area is pretty complicated, so the map doesn't immediately read as clearly as the other one does, but hopefully we might be able to adjust some of the colors before we publish them to really clarify the centers popping out and the corridors connecting them, and then the fabric behind at different intensities. Just to compare, this is the existing future land use map of the area. The main difference is that the new place type map creates areas that are more consistent. So while land uses change in an area as complex as this, they're grouped more broadly rather than changing for each parcel. So on this map, there's more variation. There's not as much consistency over larger areas versus here, where there's more consistency in land use. The types in this mapping of place types and future land use have clear rules. So when changes to land uses are requested, as we discussed in the questions, they can be better evaluated. Right now, there's really no rule to suggest that a property should be one or another use. So with the sectors and place types, the land use is evaluated based on the sector first, and then upon the location on a corridor or in a center where applicable, or this place type that's surrounding it. So the goal is greater consistency and to coordinate land use over a wider area, not just individual properties, so that we're creating places and maintaining places that exist. So here's one more example in Pine Hills. So at the intersection of Silver Star and Hiawassee and Pine Hills Road. This one is also fairly simple. The sector map is pretty clear. There's the targeted sector, which is around the commercial properties that are on Silver Star, Hiawassee, and Pine Hills. Everything else is the established sector, though there is that strange special sector sitting there, which is on the communications tower. So here's the black line, which is the boundary of the targeted sector. Identifying mostly commercial parcels along the major corridors. Now it does jog a little bit, and that's because there are single-family detached neighborhoods that come up to Silver Star or cross Silver Star. So the targeted sector kind of jogs around those so as not to change their land use in the future. So here's the place types for the area with the outline of the targeted sector. Within the targeted sector, like the others, are the centers, corridors, and traditional fabric. And the established sector are the mixed, the low growth types, the suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. I will note that the special sector here, you'll see that we mapped it as suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. That would indicate that should the communications tower site be redeveloped sometime in the future, that it should be suburban mixed neighborhood fabric because it's in the established sector, but it's a large infill property, so it should maintain consistency, compatibility of character with the surrounding areas, but it would be a place to encourage for some missing middle infill. Now, some other things that pop out here is, on Powers Drive, there's a little bit of transit corridor mapped up there. Maybe that's not actually transit corridor. I know it's a commercial property. So these are sort of questions that when you start to map, you can say, well, that seems odd. Let's take a look and see why that is. But if you look at the previous version of future land use, it's really hard to make those things out. So here are the centers. These are mapped as neighborhood centers due to their scale. It could be possible at Hiawassee or Pine Hills that those would be urban centers, and the neighborhood center here in the middle may be maybe a corridor, a transit corridor. But in the translation from existing land use, we end up with 3 neighborhood centers along Silver Star. And then the corridors, just transit corridors in these examples. As I said, that little bit on North Powers looks weird when we separate it out. And so by looking at the rules of the place type, and because these types have rules, we can evaluate whether it's appropriate based on sort of looking at that. Well, here's the rule. Does that seem to be in the right place? But in terms of transit corridors, you can really see Pine Hills Road demonstrates that. Of course, the gap in Pine Hills is where the center is, and the corridor is outside of that, covering that drive as a corridor. And here's the special place types. And they're not all in the special sector, and they're principally in the established sector. So these represent the open space type, special place types like education, the natural areas type, especially the Parks and Rec, the regional trail there. And so the remaining area is neighborhood fabric. The deeper orange, like others, is traditional neighborhood fabric in the targeted sector, which is higher intensity and mixed use. Not mixed use, mixed housing types, missing middle. The remaining is mostly suburban neighborhood fabric with some suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. Again, the communications tower, like I said, is there with the suburban mixed fabric in terms of its redevelopment potential. So here's the composite map with the incorporated areas. There's not much of it. In this case, most of the area is unincorporated Orange County, so the sectors and place types would be applicable in the area. So hopefully these examples help to point out the differences and understand the differences between the types and how they might be applied to direct the character and intensity of future development, and that there are options as we build these maps to try to build clarity and predictability into the future. So these will continue to be refined and they'll be posted for public view before long. So today we've covered a lot of ground in terms of sectors and place types. You know, it may not be too many things, but getting new concepts, you want a while to absorb that so that you're really able to converse and discern whether you think the maps are correct or should be modified. So, our goals, sharing these comprehensive plan concepts so that the public can interpret the maps that are released for review and ultimately interact better with the comprehensive plan. So again, a survey is going to be shared to capture specific feedback and absolutely check on the Vision 2050 website because there's more surveys there as well. And again, we'll jump into the Orange Code in the next series of town halls and how that Orange Code connects to these policies of sectors and place types. We'll leave up this last graphic that correlates the different place types and sectors. And of course, as we've discussed, sometimes there's place types that are applied outside of the sector they're intended in. So, right, for close evaluation of the choice in that specific situation. But now we'll have a second round of Q&A and discussion. So again, put the questions into the Zoom Q&A, and we've been monitoring what we can on social media, and I'll turn it over to Marina for questions.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to start with one of my own before I go into everybody else's, because I think some people would be interested in knowing this. Is there a minimum or maximum size to the fabric types, in particular to the fabric types and potentially to the center types?
The centers, there's a goal for centers based on how deep they are away from the streets from the major roads. The reason that there's that goal in the centers is that when you are deep enough, you can start to add additional streets and create a gridded network of streets and blocks that then becomes a larger place. If you're not big enough, then you fall into a smaller category like the neighborhood center. Neighborhood centers are still centers, they're still places of mixed use activity, but they're not quite large enough to have a grid of additional streets, so they function differently. That's one type that has certain characteristics of scale. The other are the corridors, and those are mapped at a certain distance, and it varies, but between 200 and 500 feet from the corridor itself, because parcel lines are jagged, and you don't want this crazy corridor that's going all over the place just because nobody subdivided this like 20-acre parcel that's super deep. But that sets a goal for drawing the line of where the corridor is located off the corridor. In terms of the neighborhood fabric, those don't have any specific minimums or maximums in terms of their area. We'd like to group place types by pedestrian sheds, these walk sheds, like how far people can walk in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes, in 15 minutes. But that to understand the places in terms of walkability from that scale, that's really about the mixture of how frequently do you have a center and how much neighborhood fabric, where are the centers located in reference to the neighborhood fabric. Now in the neighborhood fabric, those different types really have more to do with, say, transitions of intensity from the more intense centers and corridors towards the less intense suburban fabric. Though it doesn't always work out exactly like that, because in general, the goal for most of the single family fabric is not really to rock the boat there. And so there's a lot of suburban neighborhood fabric that is sort of coming into these corridors and so forth that remains suburban neighborhood fabric, because there are other areas where infill will have an easier time with compatibility.
Okay, and so the I'm going to piggyback on that. Two questions that I reserved from the first session to now, which is, and I'm going to group them together. What type of growth is anticipated, and what type of mixed uses are anticipated in the targeted and grow sectors? And so I think maybe you can speak a little bit to the correlation between these place types and now the zoning categories that are going to enable certain building types, which will be a presentation in series 3, but at least paint a picture of the mix of building types and uses that these place types are intended to encourage.
Sure. Well, and first we talk about compatibility, and compatibility has more to do with the size of buildings, the height, how big they are, how much of their property they take up, more so than the specific use in the building in a lot of instances. And that is, there's some uses, industrial uses in particular, that you try to separate, that you want to separate from housing in general. But a lot of other uses, like a grocery store or a restaurant or the pharmacy, those are perfectly compatible with residential. But the question is, what is the building like? Can they occupy the same space effectively? Now, if we're on a grid of streets and the buildings are all 3 stories, and the pharmacy happens to be at the ground floor with some apartments above, and there are other buildings of that character around them, then that's compatible. But that is not compatible being directly next to a single-family detached house. And what we do in terms of compatibility between the place types and the zoning code is to group things by intensity of activity. So more intense and dense multifamily housing is generally compatible with intense commercial activities and office, right? Those work together, and the buildings can be of a similar form, and they can actually mix together in the same building. So those are in a zone that is more intense, and the single family detached is in a zone that is less intense, that is really all about single family detached. And then there's zones in between that get more a greater mixture of housing types, and then a greater mixture of uses as they go up in scale and intensity. In terms of specific uses, one of the things that Orange Code does off the bat, and there's this crazy map that shows how it works, but you can't even just display it on a screen. We'll have to print it, for some public engagements going forward. But that is, there are so many specific uses today in your zoning code, and they don't need to be separated in so many categories. So one of the first things that Orange Code does is to simplify the categories by grouping similar uses together into more generalized categories. Now that makes it easier, especially on the sort of land use and business side. If I want to change my business from a nail salon to a barbershop, does that really need to be a separate use? But today they'd be a separate use. So we're grouping those sorts of things together and then connecting them in a compatible way with the type of housing that they work alongside. Now, most things in the mixed use are lodging, hotels and bed and breakfasts of different scales, restaurants and food service of different sizes, grocery, general retail like clothing stores and nail salons and hairstylists and so forth. Like all those general uses that you might find on a main street or in downtown Orlando, those mix perfectly well with housing, generally multifamily housing, a lot of times in the same building. So those are mixed together in the centers. And then in just next to the centers, this sort of traditional neighborhood fabric, that's where we have smaller scale buildings. So the height and the setbacks become similar, but you may be able to have a few townhomes or a duplex, or say a building of 6 multifamily units or 4 multifamily units, and maybe some small single family houses on small lots or cottages, right? But those can all mix together, and perhaps a small cafe of 1,000 square feet, not a 5,000 square foot, shopping, grocery store, not a Starbucks with a drive-through, but just something small that you would allow to be in that type of environment. And then down to the sort of lower end of the scale, which is purely single-family residential, and so we try to align those in a way that they transition as smoothly as possible from the more intense to the less intense, which achieves compatibility through that transition. Now, the zoning code sets up some of those transitions, and they're also embedded in the place types, and we talked about that in terms of the corridors.
That's right. So the next question, I think I'm going to direct to Alberto, which is, can you just, well, the comment is, thank you for presenting such a well-considered and understandable growth framework. Thank you to the person who wrote that. But can you describe how Orlando's future land use framework and growth patterns informed your planning approach or your plans approach?
Well, there are different examples that we continue to observe in terms of how Orlando planning approach influences the unincorporated areas of Orange County. Adjacencies to downtown, for example, and compatible areas in terms of densities and intensities, and how to continue to coordinate the corridor environments. The corridors, again, I just want to emphasize, and I think having the city of Orlando adjacent to this topic is really, really important, is the fact that when we think Orange County's Vision 2050 continues to think of corridors themselves, those become future land uses. When we think about transit corridors, when we think about Main Street corridors, they really begin to be future land uses in ways that we haven't really detailed in the planning process before. We speak of walkability as a guiding principle, but we also need to think about sittability when you are able to sit and enjoy the specific public realm environment. We need to think about transit environment, transability. How are you able to not depend only on your automobile to be able to interact with that particular place? So I think that the constant dialogue between the city of Orlando and Orange County at the planning level, with downtown densities, intensities, within International Drive, what happens north of Carrier or Sand Lake Road, where there are the boundaries, and those are not hard boundaries. We continue to coordinate in ways so that the experience is fluid between unincorporated to incorporated areas. So and other corridors as well. Summer Boulevard is another example where we continue to think about the way to design, master plan, and envision the growth along those corridors for the next decades.
Thank you. I'm going to now try and group two questions together because they really relate to affordability. And often we think about affordability for housing, but we have to think about affordability for businesses as well. And so there's two questions here that I'm going to throw to you, Alberto, too. The first one is, do you envision ADUs being allowed in the suburban fabric area? And we've seen, well, let me give you both questions. So will ADUs be allowed? We know that the code is addressing that. And is there consideration in regards to small businesses and how to allow businesses in terms of more businesses in terms of space affordability, ease of developing a small business in our communities as well? So Matt spoke a little bit about the codes, the Orange Code's goal of really trying to streamline the process, make it easier for people to do ADUs, make it easier for people to have small businesses as well as larger businesses. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that point, Alberto.
Yeah, so on the topic of accessory dwelling units, and would they be allowed in suburban areas? Orange County, the Board of County Commissioners took the approach, or already made the decision, as one of the low-hanging fruits output of Housing for All, to advance, to eliminate all of the barriers that were directly associated to accessory dwelling units, in terms of allowing them to take place within any residential district in Orange County. So it's allowed today. Obviously, there was a lot of caution about the different levels of impacts. I think Vision 2050, with much more specific, context-sensitive approach and focus areas and adjacencies to those focus areas along the suburban environment, I think that generates a little bit more predictability as to how this missing middle product type could be nestled in a way that it is compatible with the existing character of those neighborhoods. So I believe that, by not only identifying that product type early on as part of Housing for All, but even before Housing for All was accepted by the Board of County Commissioners, this particular amendment to the Land Development Code, strategically to relax some of those barriers, took place. So it's already something that Orange Code will continue to celebrate in the way that it's drafted, and continue to be refined. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the next series. In terms of affordable businesses, I'm just going to point to another opportunity here when we speak of the topic of affordability and missing middle. We disregard the product type of live-work units often because we have palpable examples in Central Florida, within the city of Orlando, and perhaps even in adjacent counties. Baldwin Park, for example, has a series of different live-work units that are perceived to be very expensive, and they really are. We have not gotten into a very strategic mechanism to understand that when you live and work within the same envelope or volume, you're able to save quite a bit of expenditures if you're a small business owner. And the strategic placement of some of those product types within the context of a transition between a much more established neighborhood into a targeted area where you're going to have, a transition into higher density residential or even transit. This particular type of products needs to continue to be encouraged. We see some examples in Horizon West that have been successful. As to the level of affordability, well, we have a 10-year action plan that we need to continue to strategically implement for effectiveness, not only for the developer, but also for the end user, those small business owners that want to be able to start a business, and they need to not only save on the cost of housing, but also the cost of the rent for the business and even transportation. The crisis is directly associated. You can't solve the housing deficit or the housing affordability challenge without addressing the transportation crisis that we have in Orange County.
Yes, I would say that with LiveWorks as well in particular, there's a couple of things worth mentioning. The first one is that they were not so recently anymore, reclassified as from commercial building types to residential building types, which makes them easier to build. Number two, they can contribute towards while they may be more expensive than a single family home, they can contribute to the affordable workplace by, it doesn't mean that you're living and working in the same building. You can be helping offset your mortgage by buying a unit and working downstairs and renting above, or living above and renting below. We see a lot of examples of that happening. And lastly, they are they're a very good transition between commercial and residential areas too. And I would say that now with the pandemic and more people more than likely permanently working more from home than they have in the past, or at least a few less days going into the office, we're seeing demand for these kinds of spaces really accelerate as well.
And that's a good carryover to some things that I was going to mention. One of which are the revised home occupation standards that we've looked at specifically in Orange Code, and also, well, you mentioned LiveWorks. I talked about it a little bit in the traditional neighborhood fabric, but there are zones in the Orange Code aligned with many of these place types, especially in the targeted sector, that are aimed at allowing live-work units and other smaller footprint businesses. But we've also done a lot with the parking standards, looking at how excessive parking standards can negatively impact small businesses, and these we're tying more closely to place types, because the character of the place is a better determinant of the amount of parking that would be required, more so than the use. And so there's a close alignment there to reduce the burden on small businesses.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to direct now a couple of questions again to Alberto, because they are plan and place or place specific. How will you reconcile or incorporate special area plans such as the QBT Next? It appears they could fit under both intended and targeted. And I'm not sure if it relates to the Pine Hills 2004 plan, but there was a task force plan. How is that one going to be used? And I would say that they're helping to inform this, of course, right?
Absolutely. So we continue to evaluate the level, the approval process, the buy-in of the local property owners, business owners, and residents that form part of those, of embracing those overlays, and hopefully, because some of them have been on idle mode for quite some years now, we want to be able to find the teeth through Vision 2050 as a policy, and through Orange Code as the mechanism to implement that policy, to begin to insert a little bit more predictability and attractive from a degree attractiveness to the public sector for assurance of investment. You know, a lot of those overlays in some of those areas, even though they may have had a good powwow or a good interaction for many months with the community, and a plan has been nicely bounded and put aside. Now Vision 2050, and part of our responsibility here is to begin to identify each one of those initiatives, and there are many of them, and integrate them into one plan, into Vision 2050 plan. In that way, we won't continue to defer or by reference some of these small scale, neighborhood scale type of plans would not be isolated. They would all be part of Vision 2050. So we really want to consider that approach, and part of this initiative as identified by the mayor. Actually, he has charged staff with that level of responsibility to begin to think about the major strategies and turn them all into one vision. So that's what this is.
Good. Thank you. I'm going to throw another question to you that has to do with the vision. Will the plan encompass the full development plan until 2050? And they use the example of Maitland Boulevard was just developed and almost finished, yet now they're talking about redoing another section in about a 2-year time frame. Seems like wasted taxpayer and not proper planning. So I think maybe touching on the idea of really trying to correlate corridor planning with the place types that are along them and the sector types. That's one of the reasons why we're looking at the big picture rather than the future land use, to probably avoid revisiting certain streets over and over again. But maybe you can elaborate on that, Alberto.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the example referenced as Maitland is a good one. I mean, Maitland has been trying to reinvent itself for quite some years now, and they're testing the approach by implementing, around the station area. They have densified, they have attempted to create a main street environment in a corridor that is highly vehicular in terms of environment 1792 and adjacent streets. And it is a downtown in the making. So I anticipate that there's going to be quite a bit of an evolution until there is that much more defined main street characteristic that makes building placement, building height, building volume, and scale work all together into one. And I think absolutely us looking at the correlation between the three levels of planning, the three perspectives, the three scales that we're talking about, understanding the county's diversity at the planning area type level, which are our market areas, beginning to define that the county's strategic implementation of sustainable practices of low impact development, for example, work a lot better on the western side, on the western region of Orange County than in the eastern region of the county because of the water table conditions. So we're able to synthesize those practices and associate in what market areas we would be able to encourage or incentivize some of these practices to take place. And at that level, we're also beginning to look at the sectors themselves and the specific place types in association to those existing communities for preservation purposes as well. So I think this is a coherent strategy. You have already participated and formed part of this first series of meetings with a lot of very important questions. We continue, the residents, and we continue to receive your input since September of last year via the surveys that are out there in our webpage, and we'll continue to have 2 more specific surveys. So we cannot do this in isolation. We need to continue to engage throughout this process with the residents and stakeholders to be able to understand the future.
Thank you. And I think the idea of these sectors and in particular the place types is really to begin to establish a physical vision of how the county would grow. And that's often what's lacking in comprehensive plans. There's lots of policies, objectives, and goals which are equally important, but the physical vision is what this is attempting to do. But in relationship to these goals, objectives, and policies, Alberto, there's a question about how do arts and cultural area factor into this? And is there a correlation between that and density?
Absolutely. Arts and culture, so important and critical. When we think about the human scale, the residents, the social aspects of Orange County, putting aside all the physical aspects. When we think about the creative class in Orange County, we should not only be responsible on attracting the creative class, but preserving the creative class within the county. That makes us a much more desirable place, a richer environment for our own future education, and finding strategically where those places should be incentivized, and those places that are also affordable for artists to be able to create and to be able to be inspired as well. So we are looking at very specific areas where not only their product, their art form could be celebrated at different scales. We see an example here in the administration building, the greatest advantage that has been taken of an open space, a green space. Now you have an experience on a daily basis, at least for those that come and visit the administration building, of a display of sculptures, at a different level that changes over the year time frame. But we're looking at areas of opportunities around perhaps the most dense and intense areas to carve out these very unique urban spaces to promote art in different, not only by art galleries, but in the open space areas around Pine Castle, for example, Meadowwoods. International Drive is another area to pay attention as it continues to evolve from a suburban environment to a much more thriving urban environment. Even the Taft community adjacent to industrial areas, and we have identified specific targeted intersections there. Lockhart, is another very important community where we think that even though there may be a specific opportunity for the transformation of a main street, there is a gateway that celebrates its presence by a mural that represents its history. So what a better way to identify a point of arrival, not only to look into the future, but understanding its past and what it brings to how the next 30 years should be planned.
Very nice. So we're going to move from arts and culture to historic districts. There's a question that says Edgewater and QBT areas are in the targeted areas, but yet also a historic district. Can you explain how that will work? I mean, I would say that, of course, the underlying zoning, if there are historic preservations, will take precedence over that.
Yeah, and I think that is correct. I mean, there's certain areas that we would like to continue to celebrate their history by the zoning code and how those specific buildings and areas and environments will continue to be preserved as a volume, and without necessarily going into the discardable mode where the history just becomes erased because new uses come into the area.
Yeah, I apologize. I keep saying QBT. I meant OBT. So a few last questions for you again, Alberto, because it speaks to the other elements of the comprehensive plan. And that has to do with in the high density targeted sectors, what types of traffic studies and safety measures are being taken into consideration for this anticipated growth?
So when we think of the way that the targeted sector is delineated today didn't happen by accident or just by pure analysis of existing context. We have looked at very specific areas where employment centers exist and have staying power, where the population lives today and are attracted to live within close proximity to their place of employment. And we have also looked at specific corridors, alternative analysis for corridors for future transit at the different technologies, from rubber tire to bus rapid transit to perhaps light rail and high-speed rail, even now being part of our conversation in Orange County. So we continue to look at those specific corridors and how they connect to the employment centers. And that general delineation, with the help of the access and opportunity model, which is GIS-based and identifies all of those areas of services, education, existing residential environments, and transit studies, they gave us the general delineation of what that targeted area is. We identified the 6% that was presented today. That continues to evolve, and it's not in stone right now. But also above and beyond that, because those parcels are mostly commercial, and we've also identified that if this 6% is about 50-some thousand acres of Orange County, about half of those, 25,000 acres of that general area, is either undeveloped or underdeveloped. So we're able to look at that specific area and really understand that there's quite a bit of opportunity there for not only addressing the housing crisis, but also the alternative modes that moves us away from the dependability of the automobile into transit.
Thank you. There's a very, well, it may not be a quick question. I don't know if there's a good answer to this, but people are wondering, this is a physical layout a question, why are unincorporated enclaves among incorporated areas? And we saw examples of that in the maps that Matt showed.
So we would,
especially the last round too.
Exactly.
Yeah, so we continue to refine those specific maps, unincorporated enclaves within the unincorporated areas. You know, we have the enclaves that we have in Orange County today. You know, are the rural settlements as well as the rural residential enclaves, and those are very unique in nature. They have taken quite a bit of analysis and study from local residents to be able to be preserved and not evolve or change over the future. So I like to better understand the specifics of what they're referring to in terms of the question, because it may not be related, but that's what comes to mind in terms of specific areas that are kind of unique within unincorporated Orange County.
Well, I think it's more of yesterday when we were looking at the Northwest, you know, we sort of zoomed in to different parts of the map where the annexation pattern was such that there's little pieces of unincorporated county that fall within this larger sort of spider web of incorporated area.
Yeah, and that's another interesting relationship that we have with our municipalities, right? There are some joint planning agreements that establish the rules of annexation, and usually, you know, the way to move forward with a positive approach of annexation is not to create enclaves within unincorporated areas. So there, you know, we can continue to look at the maps and see exactly what those areas are.
Great, thank you. In light of the time, I want to be cognizant of and respectful of people's time, so I'm going to throw out 2 or 3 more questions to you, Alberto, and maybe one more to Matt. For the established areas, are there, and this ties into the question we heard earlier, but are there plans for revitalization and greenery and beautification? It's not only intended for the targeted areas, correct?
Yeah, so an ongoing conversation between the planning division, the zoning division, and Parks and Rec is to continue to better define and carve out policies that looks at a different scale of parks, of community parks and open spaces, and the commitment for maintenance of those pocket parks and squares and plazas that are public, but they are not in the menu of, if you would, of community parks, because those tend to be 20 acres or more, and they have very active fields and some passive, but the reality is that this smaller scale of nestled in open spaces in areas that are very dense and intense are very critical and important in land development codes that have been already adopted in Orange County, that are geared towards higher densities and intensities and very urban scale environments. We have already introduced the requirement for developments to carry those 30% and 10% open space areas where they're not just residual leftover spaces that are just meeting the requirement, but they need to be well integrated into the urban fabric. And that's something that, you know, hopefully Orange Code will continue to regulate in different ways.
That's right. We've touched on this question a little bit throughout the presentation, but maybe Matt, you want to add a little bit to it. It says, how will Vision 2050 work to address and ensure equitable development? And the example they give here is how do you ensure, for example, that truck traffic is not redistributed to unincorporated neighborhoods? So maybe that's speaking to the objectives and the policies that are going to accompany this document.
Yeah, that might be on Alberto on the policy side of things.
Yeah.
So we continue to work with a specific, transportation planning really has a big say on the policies in terms of truck traffic and where that would continue to take place in terms of freight. And in our master plan of thoroughfares in Orange County, we continue to look at those specific different categories. We need to do a much better coordination now that Vision 2050 is taking off, to better understand the different categories of context sensitivity approach, consistent to what FDOT is doing, but context sensitive roadways and the different types of vehicles that transverse those roadways is also part of this overall coordination effort that's going on.
Well, and so some of that will hopefully be apparent in the mapping, as we look at place types in different areas, because those will coordinate with DOT's categories and where they align freight routes and other things like that. So for example, the neighborhood fabrics are places that, given the context translation, would not be places that freight routes would be oriented, and instead they might be oriented towards the suburban corridors, the transit corridors, hopefully away from the Main Street corridors. But those are the sorts of things that can be aligned between the place types and the context zones to then align with transportation policy.
So that's right. I see a comment here that says the city of Orlando picks up land because developers cup up neighborhoods and the county and city work better together. And there's a comment that Marcos made earlier on, which I forgot to say, but I think it's an important one, which is the emphasizing that our goal is not simply to remove and ignore the incorporated areas, but instead use the place types and sectors specifically to identify areas for future coordination and cooperation with the city with the city essentially. So I think that's an important point that we mustn't forget. And then I'm going to group the last two questions together because one of them is a specific question about Cheracona and Ocoee and Powers Road being in a growth sector. And that will probably, so someone's making a comment about that. And so the question here is, what are the other communication or resident outreach methods which will be implemented to get additional public input? So for people to be able to provide specific comments on these maps, Alberto, how I'd like to end on this question, which is, what are the other outreach strategies, or how will comments be provided once these maps are uploaded?
Yeah, so there are several maps that are going to be part of this series in which we're going to be seeking for additional input, and this is one of them. You're going to be able to see that even though you may have identified Clarkona, Hiawassee, and other specific corridors, you would once you zoom in, you would understand that it only happens at the intersection of 50 and Hiawassee, for example, where there is a center identified that is part of that targeted sector, and it's not the entire corridor, because we're trying to be very specific as to, again, the general delineation of that vision map. So I believe that would be the very important tool to be able to provide a PDF level map, not only of the sectors, but also as we continue to develop the future land use map, which are going to be the place type map, and find a process to be able to correlate graphically and with the reference of the streets, how all of this is working together. So hopefully we will be able to come up with a mechanism so that the residents out there that are looking at or following this process can better understand the initial planning approach and then give us comments based on those.
Great. And one last question came in for Matt. So I'm going to send it your way, Matt, which is transit been alluded to many times. How, other than roads, how will the multimodal transit play in these areas and in these plans? And in fact, somebody made a comment about it would be really good to see, and we've talked about this, transit corridors overlaid on the sectors and place types. So that map will eventually be forthcoming.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But you're asking about other systems. I mean, there are some there's some things that are overlays, like bike routes and whatnot. But really, what makes other modes of transportation besides the car and besides larger public transit function is having diverse and intense land uses near each other, and also easily accessible from the surrounding neighborhoods. And so the centers and the corridors themselves are intended to, the centers especially, to be that node of multimodal activity, not just multimodal in terms of what is normally discussed, like transit and pedestrian, but also, of course, the car and bikes and micromobility in terms of whatever that becomes, whether it's bike shares or scooters or, all the people on the little one-wheel things that float around pretty interestingly. I don't know what they're called, but these micromobility solutions are evolving, but they really work. They sort of extend your walking distance. So you can think from the sort of walking distance standpoint, and then extend it with these other mobility solutions. And so that comes to the point of connectivity. And connectivity is something that in the past has not been part of the rules for development. Now in the established sector, there should be a view to try to increase connectivity where possible. With ways, they don't have to be vehicular ways, but other ways for people to reach their destination on multiple modes. In terms of new development, both in redevelopment of centers and in corridors, and even smaller parcel developments, the Orange Code, in terms of its standards, it's sort of a mixture between, it's becoming a unified development ordinance, right? So mixing zoning and subdivision standards so that they're coordinated, because a lot of times, just like zoning and comprehensive plans, a lot of times those aren't coordinated. Often the zoning and subdivision standards aren't coordinated either. And so mixing those together, it's ensuring that new development occurs on structure of streets and blocks and buildings that becomes accessible by not just the car, but easily accessible other modes of transportation. I'll tell you that, while bike routes are wonderful, and most of the biking, and I do plenty of it, is on very slow neighborhood streets. Now, if you're building streets that are too wide, don't have parking, those are going to end up being speedier and really not support biking, and especially not be very good for walking either. But in the process of going through Orange Code, we've also spent a lot of time with Public Works and Transportation Planning to work on detailing and allowing streets that are aimed at walkability and bikeability more broadly throughout the county.
Thank you, Matt. And I think this is a good place to end. We want to thank everybody for the really good questions that were thrown our way, and remind you to please continue to stay involved. And first, take the survey for those of you who are on the webinar, on the Zoom webinar. We would really appreciate your input. But we look forward to continued engagement and continued discussion on these place types and sectors. And I don't know, Alberto, if there are any commissioners who may want to have some final words, but I wanted to thank everyone who's participated and who has stayed on past the 8 o'clock hour.
Sure, I'll open up the floor for any of the commissioners that are still with us. Commissioner Bonilla, Commissioner Ziplin.
This is Commissioner Emily Bonilla. I just want to reiterate, thank you everyone for your participation, and thank you for staff for all the hard work that you put into this. And thank you to the consultants as well.
Thank you.
This is Commissioner Ziplin. I just wanted to say this has been a very thorough presentation and discussion. And I think some of the issues that were raised in tonight's meeting, I think we as commissioners, we're like-minded, it seems like, with the residents. So I look forward to further discussion, and thank you again to the residents that participated, and also to staff and everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Be safe, and we will see everybody next Tuesday.
Monday.
Well,
Oh,
Monday.
sorry. Apologies. Next Monday. That's right. Next Monday, next Wednesday, and next Thursday.
That's right.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.